The hum of the server room was a low-frequency headache, competing with the smell of stale espresso and the overwhelming, crisp scent of sandalwood that clung to Evelyn. It was 2 in the morning. We were the only living things left in the firm. Evelyn leaned over the drafting table, her focus absolute, her silhouette sharp against the city lights bleeding through the glass. Then, her hand moved. It wasn't a gesture, it was a claim. Her pinky finger grazed my knuckle, a micro-movement that screamed louder than the sirens outside. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs. The professional line hadn't just been blurred. She had deliberately stepped over it. 3 weeks earlier, the Harbor Reconnection Project was just a file on my desk and a hypothetical migraine. It was the kind of urban renewal initiative that defined careers, turning a defunct, rusted industrial waterfront into the city's new circulatory system. I was the pragmatic urban planner, the one who fought for the space between the buildings. I advocated for community gardens, permeable pavement, and zoning laws that prioritized human connection over profit margins. I saw the city as a living organism. I wanted flow, accessibility, and spaces where people could actually breathe without paying an admission fee. Then there was Evelyn, the star architect. I knew the reputation before I knew the woman. Brilliant, uncompromising, and cold enough to freeze the condensation on a water glass. She walked into that first strategy meeting like she owned the oxygen in the room. Her suit was tailored to within an inch of its life, a sharp navy cut that made her look less like a creative partner and more like a finely honed weapon. She didn't take the seat offered to her. She paced. She threw my initial environmental impact report onto the mahogany table with a dismissive wave of a manicured hand. "Greenways are quaint, Eliza," she had said, her voice a smooth, low contralto that unfortunately sent a shiver down my spine. "But this city doesn't need quaint. It needs monumental. We are building a legacy here, not a park for dog walkers." She wanted sleek glass towers that scraped the sky, monuments to ego and light that would dominate the skyline. I wanted integration. The debate that followed was sharp, intellectual, and surprisingly invigorating. We didn't just disagree. We clashed. I pushed back on her density ratios. She tore apart my traffic flow models. It was like fencing without the protective gear, fast, precise, and dangerous. I remember watching her as she pointed at the projection screen, dismantling my argument about shadow studies. She was arrogant. She was dismissive. She was also the most competent person I had ever been in a room with. There is a specific, treacherous kind of magnetism to someone who is undeniably excellent at what they do, even if what they're doing is dismantling your life's work. I found myself tracking the way her eyes narrowed when she calculated load-bearing limits in her head, the way her jaw set when I challenged her on public access points. The tension coiled tight in my chest. I told myself it was frustration. I told myself I hated her vision, the sterile perfection of it. But beneath the professional annoyance, there was a pull. A dangerous, quiet appreciation for the way she refused to shrink. I caught myself wondering if that intensity, that laser-focused drive, translated to anything other than zoning disputes. The way she commanded the room was undeniably attractive, a gravitational force that I had to actively resist. The meeting ended with a stalemate and a mandate from the partners that felt more like a sentence. "Merge the visions," the senior director had said, checking his watch and oblivious to the static electricity crackling between us. "We have the city council hearing in 3 weeks. Figure it out, or we lose the bid." We walked out of the conference room in silence. The air between us was heavy. She didn't look at me, just checked her phone and kept walking, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic cadence on the polished concrete. I watched her go, feeling the headache start behind my eyes. I knew then that this project wasn't just going to test my professional skills. It was going to dismantle my peace of mind, brick by brick. The challenge wasn't just the blueprints. It was the woman who wanted to rewrite the skyline, and the fact that I wanted to watch her do it. My sanctuary is a glass box floating 40 stories above the grid. From here, the city is just geometry. Lines of light, blocks of shadow, a perfectly ordered system of inputs and outputs. I like the view because it's the only place where the chaos of human life looks manageable. Down there, it's noise and traffic. Up here, it's a blueprint come to life. I have built a career, a reputation, and a very expensive life on the principle that if you design the structure correctly, the people inside it will fall into line. Control isn't just a preference, it is an aesthetic. But Eliza was a variable I couldn't solve. Usually consultants are decorative. They come in, they nod at my renderings, they offer a few timid suggestions about sustainability or community impact, and then they fold the moment I raise an eyebrow. I am used to being the smartest, sharpest object in the room. I am used to people smoothing themselves out to fit around me. Eliza, however, had apparently missed the memo on my infallibility. She was stubborn. Not in a loud, brash way, but in the way a tree root is stubborn when it decides to crack a concrete sidewalk. She was quiet, persistent, and utterly immovable. It was infuriating. It was also the most interesting thing that had happened in this office in 5 years. The first week of our forced collaboration established a pattern that felt less like work and more like a siege. The firm empties out by 7. The junior associates scatter to the bars in the district, the cleaners move through with their silent vacuums, and the building settles into a deep, pressurized quiet. That was when the real dynamic emerged. Without the audience of the boardroom, the air between us changed. It grew thin, high-altitude tight. I sat at the head of the table, my laptop screen glowing cool blue, while she commandeered the other end, spreading her chaotic, hand-drawn sketches over my pristine schematics. I told myself I was staying late to ensure quality control. I told myself I needed to supervise her, to make sure she didn't ruin the clean lines of my atrium with some sentimental request for a community mural. But that was a lie. I was staying for the show. I found myself tracking the sensory details of her presence with an intensity that bordered on clinical obsession. The sound of her typing was distinct, fast, rhythmic, aggressive bursts of thought hitting the keys. I learned the specific cadence of her voice when she was defending a design choice. It would drop, just slightly, losing the professional polish and gaining a textured, gravelly warmth that vibrated in the quiet room. "You're designing for a render," she would say, not looking up, her pencil scratching aggressively against the paper. "I'm designing for the person who has to walk home in the rain." I would lean back, crossing my legs, watching her. I watched her hands. They were smaller than mine, capable and constantly in motion. She talked with them, chopping the air to emphasize a point, or running her fingers through her hair when she was frustrated, leaving the strands disordered in a way that made my fingers twitch. There was a smudge of graphite on the side of her palm that she never seemed to notice. I noticed. I noticed it the same way I noticed a hairline fracture in a support beam. By Thursday, the realization hit me with the force of a structural failure. I wasn't arguing with her because I cared about the placement of the loading docks. I was arguing with her because I wanted to see that flash of fire in her eyes. I wanted to provoke her. I wanted to see how far I could push before she pushed back. I was testing the materials, applying stress to see where she was strong and where she might be soft. I was watching her frown at a spreadsheet when my phone buzzed against the glass table, the sound startlingly loud in the silence. The screen lit up with a message from the client rep. "Council hearing moved up. 2 weeks. Need the finalized model by Monday." I stared at the text. The deadline was impossible. It was a disaster. It meant late nights, weekends, and an intimacy of proximity that I wasn't sure either of us could survive. I looked up at Eliza, who was still chewing on the end of her pencil, oblivious to the shift. A slow, dangerous heat curled in my stomach. "Check your email," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet. "We're not going home." The transition from the sterile, climate-controlled silence of the firm to the raw chaos of the harbor site was jarring. It smelled of wet concrete, ozone, and the metallic tang of welding fumes. The sky was a bruised purple, threatening more than just rain. It was coming down in sheets, blurring the skyline into a watercolor of grays and silvers. I adjusted my hard hat, the plastic rim digging into my forehead, and watched Evelyn navigate the mud. It should have been funny, the star architect in her Italian leather boots trying to sidestep puddles of industrial sludge, but she moved with a grim determination that killed the joke. She wasn't complaining. She was treating the mud like a zoning error she intended to correct later. We had to take the construction hoist to the unfinished 14th floor to check the sightlines for the proposed atrium. The hoist was a rattling metal cage attached to the skeleton of the building, open to the elements on 3 sides. We stepped in, and the operator, a burly guy named Mike who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, slammed the gate shut. The machinery groaned into life. The space was impossibly small. It was designed for pallets of drywall, not 2 women carrying the weight of a failing partnership and 3 weeks of suppressed tension. The air inside the cage was damp and heavy. As we ascended, the city dropped away, replaced by the rhythmic clanking of the lift gears and the howling wind. Evelyn stood next to me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off her damp trench coat. I could smell the rain on her, a sharp, clean scent mixing with that pervasive sandalwood. It was intoxicating, a sensory overload that made the small cage feel even smaller. Every time the lift jolted over a track seam, her shoulder brushed against my arm. It wasn't a collision, it was a friction point, a repeated, rhythmic contact that sent a jolt of awareness straight down my spine. I stared straight ahead at the wet girders passing by, but my entire focus was on that 3 inches of space between us. Then the lift hit a particularly rough patch of track and shuddered violently. Evelyn's heel caught on the uneven metal grating of the floor. She pitched forward, a sudden break in her perfect verticality. Instinct took over before my brain could catch up. My hand shot out, gripping her elbow to steady her. It was a firm, grounding grip, necessary to keep her upright. But the moment the lift stabilized, I didn't let go. For 2 seconds that felt like an hour, we were frozen. My fingers were wrapped around the wet wool of her coat, feeling the tension in the arm beneath it. She was rigid, braced against the fall, but under my hand, I felt a tremor. Not fear, exactly. Vibration. Like a high-tension wire humming under load. She looked up at me, her hair plastered to her cheek, her eyes wide and dark in the gloom. The corporate mask was gone, stripped away by gravity and adrenaline. "Careful," I said, my voice barely audible over the wind. "The foundation is slippery." "I'm fine," she snapped automatically, but she didn't pull away. Her voice had dropped an octave, losing that sharp boardroom polish. It was rougher, realer. She looked down at my hand on her arm, then back up to my eyes. "I don't lose my balance, Eliza." "Everyone loses their balance eventually," I countered, keeping my grip steady. "It's about having something solid to catch you." The subtext hung between us, heavier than the humidity. In that moment, looking at the rain dripping from the brim of her hard hat, I realized something that shifted the entire axis of our conflict. The Ice Queen persona, the arrogance, the sleek glass towers. It wasn't just ego. It was armor. She was a load-bearing wall protecting something softer, something that was terrified of collapsing if she stopped pushing for perfection. It was a crack in the facade, a glimpse of the human woman living inside the legend. And God help me, that glimpse was more dangerous to my peace of mind than her arrogance ever was. The lift ground to a halt at the 14th floor, the gate clattering open with a sound like a gunshot. The spell broke. I released her arm, the absence of contact leaving my hand strangely cold, as if I'd been disconnected from a power source. The wind whipped through the open floor, freezing and violent, carrying the promise of a storm we weren't dressed for. We couldn't work here. Not like this. "Coffee," she said, breathless, turning away from the view she had fought so hard to design. "Across the street, now." The cafe was a sensory assault. a humid little box of noise and steam that stood in direct opposition to the sterile, controlled environments I preferred. The windows were fogged opaque, sealing us in with the smell of roasted beans and wet wool. It was crowded, forcing us into a corner booth that was far too small for two people trying to maintain a professional distance. But the rain outside was torrential, a gray curtain that had effectively trapped us here, stripping away the option of retreat. I sat across from her, my hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that was too hot, letting the burn ground me. I watched Eliza. She was a mess, objectively speaking. Her hair was dark with rain, plastered in chaotic waves against her neck. Her blouse was damp, clinging to her shoulders. By all my usual metrics, she should have looked unprofessional, diminished. Instead, she looked vivid. The fluorescent lights of the office usually washed her out, but here, in the low amber light of the cafe, she was high contrast and undeniable. I found myself tracking a single droplet of water. It had gathered at the end of a wet strand of hair behind her ear, trembling there for a moment before gravity won. I watched it slide down the column of her neck, tracing the line of her tendon, slipping beneath the collar of her shirt. My eyes followed the path, and, for a terrifying second, my imagination didn't stop at the fabric. I felt a phantom sensation in my own fingertips, a desire to trace that same line, not with water, but with touch. I wanted to know if her skin was as cool as the rain, or if she was burning up with the same adrenaline that was currently rewiring my nervous system. The intellectual respect I had grudgingly formed for her over the last 3 weeks was undergoing a rapid, volatile phase change. It was no longer just about her competence. It was physical. It was the way her hands moved when she pulled our tablet out of her bag, wiping the screen with a napkin. It was the way she bit her lip when she concentrated, a small, unconscious habit that drew my attention to her mouth and kept it there. "We need to rethink the plaza entrance," she said, her voice cutting through the cafe noise and my internal spiraling. She tapped the screen, oblivious to the fact that I was dissecting her micro-expressions rather than the blueprints. "Your design is impressive, Evelyn, but it's a fortress. It pushes people away. Look at the elevation." I forced my eyes to the screen, the blue light illuminating our faces in the dim booth. We were leaning in, heads close, creating a private architecture of intimacy in the middle of the crowd. "It's not a fortress," I countered, though my voice lacked its usual bite. "It's a statement. I build things that last, Eliza. I build structures that can withstand time, weather, and the chaos of the city. Permanence requires a certain level of armor." She looked up then, meeting my gaze over the glowing screen. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and far too perceptive. "Is that what you're doing?" she asked softly. "Building armor? Because you can build a monument that lasts 1,000 years, Evelyn. But if it doesn't let anyone in, it's not a building. It's a tomb." The words landed with the weight of a demolition ball. She wasn't talking about the plaza anymore, and we both knew it. She was talking about the space between us. She was challenging the very foundation of how I operated, the distance I kept, the height I maintained, the glass walls I put up to keep the variables out. I looked at her, really looked at her, and the realization hit me like a structural failure. My designs were perfect, sleek, and cold. They were impressive voids. Eliza was the connection. She was the chaotic, living element that my work and my life was missing. She was the heat in the glass box. The thought was terrifying. It destabilized me in a way no budget crisis or zoning board ever could. I was the architect, the one who controlled the environment. But sitting here, smelling the rain on her skin and feeling the magnetic pull of her proximity, I realized I was the one being redesigned. The vulnerability was intolerable. I felt exposed, as if she had just pointed out a fatal flaw in my own blueprint. I couldn't sit here and let her see the cracks. I needed the armor back. "We're done for today," I said abruptly, the words snapping out like a lock clicking shut. I grabbed my coat, ignoring the confusion that flashed across her face. "Send me the revised notes by morning. I have other matters to attend to." I stood up, putting the table between us, re-establishing the vertical hierarchy. I walked out into the rain without looking back, needing the cold shock of the storm to freeze everything back into place. I had to shut this down before it brought the whole house down. The week following our retreat from the rain-battered cafe was a masterclass in structural reinforcement. Evelyn didn't just withdraw, she fortified. She rebuilt every wall I had managed to chip away at, adding fresh layers of steel and reinforced concrete between us. She became a creature of terse emails and yellow sticky notes left on my monitor, avoiding direct conversation as if my voice were a contagion. In strategy meetings, she looked through me, not at me, treating me less like a partner and more like a zoning error she was trying to correct. It was cold, efficient, and maddening. The vibrant, rain-soaked woman who had debated philosophy with me in the booth had vanished, replaced by the high-gloss silhouette who cared only about load limits and glass opacity. It hurt more than I expected. I missed the friction. I missed the heat. By Thursday night, the air in the firm was toxic with stress. The city council presentation was 48 hours away. The 3D model, the physical heart of our pitch, sat on the central drafting table, half-finished and mocking us. It was a sprawling mess of balsa wood, acrylic, and glue that looked nothing like the unified vision we were supposed to present. The junior architects had fled hours ago, their eyes glazed over, leaving us alone in the cavernous silence of the 41st floor. It was just us and the low, maddening hum of the overhead fluorescents. The office smelled of cold takeout food, stale basil and grease, and the metallic tang of anxiety. I was glued to my laptop, trying to salvage the pedestrian flowcharts, my eyes burning from hours of staring at blue light. Across the room, Evelyn stood over the model, an X-Acto knife in her hand, her posture rigid. She was surgically removing a row of miniature trees I had fought for 2 days ago, slicing them away with terrifying precision. That was the spark. The exhaustion, the rejection, the sheer frustration of trying to work with a stone wall, it all ignited. "Stop," I said. My voice sounded too loud, too jagged in the empty room. Evelyn didn't pause. She sliced through another miniature oak, tossing the green foam into the trash. "They ruin the sightline, Eliza. We discussed this." "We didn't discuss anything," I snapped, pushing my chair back. The screech of the wheels on the concrete floor was a violent punctuation mark. I stood up and walked over to the table, my hands shaking slightly. "You decided. Just like you decided we were done talking on Tuesday. Just like you decided to pretend I don't exist for the last 3 days." She finally looked up. Her eyes were rimmed with red, dark circles bruising the thin skin beneath them. She looked impeccable in her structure, but brittle in her materials. "I am focusing on the work," she said, her voice tight, clipped. "I suggest you do the same. The council doesn't care about your feelings, and neither do I." "This isn't about the work," I countered, stepping into her space. I was tired of the distance. I wanted the reaction. I wanted the woman who had almost lost her balance in the elevator. "You're gutting the design because you're afraid of what happened in the cafe. You're stripping out the warmth because it reminds you that you're human." Evelyn stiffened, the knife freezing in midair. The light caught the sharp edge of the blade. "You are projecting," she said icily. "I am trying to win a bid. You are trying to turn a skyscraper into a community center. I am trying to build something people actually want to live in," I shouted. The anger felt good. It was hot and real and better than the freezing silence of the last week. "You want a monument to yourself. A cold, perfect, empty tower where no one can touch you. You're cutting out the trees because you can't control them, just like you're cutting me out." I was close now, leaning over the model, invading her perimeter. The physical distance between us had shrunk to nothing. I could smell that sandalwood perfume again, sharper now, mixed with the scent of stress and long hours. I waited for her to snap back. I waited for the cutting remark that would put me in my place. Instead, her shoulders dropped. The knife clattered onto the table, rolling across the blueprints. She let out a sigh, a long, ragged sound of pure exhaustion that seemed to deflate the entire room. It wasn't a surrender. It was a collapse. She closed her eyes, pinching the bridge of her nose, and the anger drained out of me instantly, replaced by a sudden, sharp concern. She didn't look like the enemy anymore. She just looked tired. That sigh cost me more than I was willing to admit. It was the sound of a pressurized system finally springing a leak, the audible release of 3 weeks of meticulously maintained tension. I stood there, hand still hovering over the mutilated model, and felt the fight drain out of me. It wasn't just exhaustion, though my body felt heavy, like I was moving through wet concrete. It was the terrifying realization that she was right. I was gutting the design because the warmth she wanted to inject into it terrified me. Warmth is unpredictable. Warmth expands. Warmth changes the state of matter, and I had spent my entire career keeping my materials cool, stable, and unchanging. I looked at Eliza. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't pressing her advantage. She just looked concerned, her anger evaporating the moment I showed a crack in the facade. That concern was worse than her fury. It was intimate. It invited me to step out of the role of the antagonist and into something far more dangerous. "I'm sorry," I said. The words felt foreign in my mouth, sharp and jagged like broken glass. I rarely apologized because I rarely made mistakes, or at least, I rarely admitted to them. "You're right. The trees stay." I turned away from her before she could respond, walking to the credenza where I kept the client gifts. I pulled out a bottle of Japanese whiskey, the amber liquid catching the low light of the city outside. My hands were steady now, but my pulse was an erratic rhythm against my collarbone. I poured 2 glasses, neat, no ice. We didn't need any more chill in this room. "Drink," I said, holding the glass out to her. It wasn't an order this time. It was a peace offering. Eliza took the glass, her fingers brushing mine, a fleeting contact that sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through my exhausted system. She didn't retreat to her side of the room. Instead, she leaned back against the drafting table, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor, her legs stretched out in front of her. She kicked off her shoes. It was such a casual, human gesture that it made my chest ache. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, calculating the risk, and then I joined her. I sat on the floor, my back against the table leg, shattering the vertical hierarchy I had enforced for weeks. We were on the same level now. The air in the room shifted. The sharp, acrid scent of stress dissipated, replaced by the rich peat smoke smell of the whiskey and the underlying, ever-present note of sandalwood and rain. It was quiet, but not the empty silence of the office. It was a heavy, sultry silence, filled with the hum of the city below and the weight of things we weren't saying. "I don't build walls to keep people out, Eliza," I said quietly, swirling the dark liquid in my glass. I wasn't looking at her. I was looking at the skyline, at the grid of lights that usually made so much sense to me. I build them because structure is the only thing that doesn't leave. People are messy, variables. Steel is constant. "Steel is cold," she countered softly. Her voice was low, vibrating in the small space between us. "And it gets lonely at 40 stories up, Evelyn." I turned my head. She was watching me, her eyes dark and unreadable in the shadows. She wasn't looking at the architect. She was looking at me. And for the first time, I didn't want to look away. The whiskey burned the pleasant path down my throat, loosening the knot in my chest. "It is," I admitted. The vulnerability was a physical sensation, like stepping off a ledge without a safety harness. "It is incredibly lonely." We sat there for a long time, just breathing the same air. The blueprints for the plaza spread out on the carpet between us, like a map of a country we were trying to conquer together. I set my glass down and leaned forward, ostensibly to point out a detail on the rendering of the central fountain. "This angle," I murmured, moving onto my knees. "If we shift the axis here, we can keep the light." I was close to her now. Too close. I could smell the shampoo she used, something floral and soft that clashed beautifully with the industrial setting. I was kneeling next to her, my arm inches from hers. It was a calculated risk. I was testing the structural integrity of the moment, pushing against the boundary to see if it would hold, or if we would finally, inevitably, collapse into each other. The whiskey sat heavy and warm in my stomach, a liquid courage I needed as Evelyn dismantled my defenses with proximity. She was kneeling next to me, the fabric of her charcoal trousers pooling on the carpet. The blueprint for the central plaza lay between us, a white and blue expanse of lines representing our war zone, now feeling like a treaty table. She leaned forward to trace the line of the retaining wall, her movement fluid and precise. I smelled the sandalwood again, stronger now, mixed with the rain on her hair and the smoky peat of the scotch. Her hand moved across the paper. It was a beautiful hand. I hated that I noticed that so vividly. Long fingers, capable, devoid of jewelry except for a simple platinum band on her right thumb. She pointed to the elevation marker. "If we drop this grade here," she murmured, her voice a low hum that vibrated through the floorboards and traveled straight into my chest, "we lose the morning shadow." Then the shift happened. The moment the world stopped turning. Her hand didn't retract. It lingered. Her index finger was still on the paper, pinning down the design. But her pinky finger, it drifted. In a crowded room, it would have been invisible, but we weren't. We were alone in the sky, suspended in the silence of 2 a.m. Her finger slid sideways, deliberately, agonizingly slow, until it grazed the side of my knuckle. It wasn't an accident. Evelyn didn't have accidents. She calculated load-bearing ratios in her sleep. She didn't accidentally brush against a colleague's hand unless she intended to test the surface. The contact was electric. It sounds cliché, but a sharp jolt raced up my arm and seized my lungs. It was a live wire, connecting 2 systems that were never meant to integrate. My breath hitched, a ragged sound that seemed deafening in the quiet. I froze, my own hand paralyzed on the paper, trapped under the implication. She didn't pull away. She let her finger rest against mine, a warm, solid pressure that demanded acknowledgement. Then, she slid her hand further, just a fraction of an inch, enough to cover the side of my hand with hers. It was a claim. It was a question. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I stared at our hands, hers elegant, mine ink-stained. This was the line. This was the professional boundary we had spent 3 weeks reinforcing with arguments and icy glares. She had just stepped over it without even blinking. Panic and desire warred. Part of me wanted to pull away, to retreat to the safety of the zoning laws. But a reckless part of me wanted to interlace our fingers. I wanted to know if her palm was as warm as I imagined. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. But I knew I couldn't let this slide. I couldn't let her treat this like another game of architectural chess. I needed to know the rules. I kept my hand still. I forced air into my lungs. Slowly, deliberately, I lifted my head. I didn't look at her mouth, though God knows I wanted to. I looked at her eyes. "Eyes up," I said. My voice was low, steady, stripping away the hesitation. Evelyn stopped looking at the blueprint. She turned her head, her neck creating a long, elegant line. Her eyes met mine. They were dark, dilated, swimming with fear, or maybe hunger. The arrogance was thin, a glass pane ready to shatter. I held her gaze. I didn't blink. I needed her to see me, not the urban planner, not the obstacle, but the woman who was currently burning up under her touch. "Are you playing with me, Evelyn?" I asked. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Because I don't have time for games. I don't have the energy to be another variable you're trying to control. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. The hum of the refrigerator in the break room down the hall seemed miles away. Evelyn didn't speak. She didn't pull her hand back. Instead, her gaze dropped. She looked at my lips, a slow, deliberate sweep that felt more intimate than the touch on my hand. Then, her eyes snapped back to mine. The power dynamic in the room flipped. She wasn't the star architect anymore. She was just a woman who had reached out and was waiting to see if she would be pushed away. She wet her lips. The movement was unconscious, devastating. "I'm not playing," she whispered. "I don't play games I can't win," I whispered. The words scraped against the silence of the room, stripping away the last layers of the invulnerable persona I had spent a decade constructing. I watched her eyes, searching for the rejection I was sure I deserved. "And I think I'm losing this one, Eliza." The admission hung there, raw and terrifying. It shattered the last pane of glass standing between us. The arrogance that usually armored my spine dissolved, leaving nothing but a raw, aching want that had been building since the moment she walked into my boardroom 3 weeks ago. I watched the realization dawn in her eyes, the shock, followed rapidly by a softening that made my breath catch in a way no structural failure ever could. I moved. It wasn't a calculated decision derived from a risk assessment. It was a gravitational necessity. My hand left the safety of the blueprint, sliding from the back of her knuckles up the slope of her wrist. I felt her pulse fluttering wildly against my fingertips, a frantic, staccato rhythm that matched my own. I traced the line of her forearm, up to the curve of her neck, until my palm finally rested against her jaw. Her skin was warm, impossibly soft against the calluses I'd earned from years of handling scale models and raw materials. She leaned into my touch, a small, unconscious movement that felt like a building finally settling onto a perfect foundation. "Evelyn," she breathed, my name sounding like a prayer or a plea in the quiet room. "Quiet," I murmured, my thumb brushing her lower lip. "I'm trying to focus." But I couldn't focus. The logic, the math, the clean lines, they were all gone. There was only the scent of her, the heat of her, the proximity of her mouth. I closed the distance. It wasn't a frantic collision. We weren't teenagers fumbling in the dark. It was a merger, a slow, deliberate claiming of space. When my lips brushed hers, the sensation was a physical shock, a sudden grounding of a live wire that had been sparking for weeks. She tasted of the cheap office whiskey and the memory of the rain that had soaked us days ago. It was the taste of relief. The kiss deepened, not out of desperation, but out of a profound need to verify that this was real. Her hands came up, tangling in the lapels of my blazer, pulling me closer until there was no air left between us. I felt the tension leave her body, flowing out of her and into me, a transfer of energy that felt more stable than any steel beam I had ever specified. I had spent my life building towers, trying to get as far away from the messy, chaotic earth as possible. But kissing Eliza felt like coming down. It felt like landing. It was the sensation of finding a center of gravity I hadn't known I was missing. We broke apart just an inch, needing air but refusing to surrender the proximity. Her forehead rested against mine. Her eyes were closed, her lashes casting long shadows on her cheeks. We were breathing the same air, sharing the same small pocket of existence while the city slept around us. "I've wanted to do that since the site visit," I confessed, the words tumbling out before I could filter them through my usual corporate dialect. "Since you caught me in the elevator." Eliza let out a shaky laugh, opening her eyes. They were dark, dilated, and wrecked in the most beautiful way. "I thought you hated me. I thought you were trying to get me fired with all those late-night emails." "I was trying to survive you," I corrected, running my thumb over her cheekbone, memorizing the architecture of her face. "You were a variable I couldn't control. It terrified me. "And now?" she asked, her voice dropping to that husky register that unmade me. "No," I said, leaning in to press a soft, lingering kiss to the corner of her mouth. "I think I'm done trying to control it." For the first time in my career, I wasn't just a structure standing alone against the wind. I was a person inhabiting a space. I felt solid, real. The blueprints on the floor were forgotten. The deadline was a distant abstraction, and the only thing that mattered was the structural integrity of the woman in my arms. We were a mess, tired, stressed, drinking on a Tuesday night. But for the first time, the design made sense. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3 a.m. The presentation was in 30 hours. The model was still half destroyed. The renderings were unfinished, and my career was potentially on the line. But looking at Eliza, flushed and disheveled, and looking at me like I was the only landmark in the city, I realized the context had changed entirely. The project wasn't the priority anymore. We were. And somehow, I knew that the work we did next would be the best thing either of us had ever built. The sun came up like a bruise over the East River, turning the gray office into a wash of lavender and steel. I woke up with a stiff neck and a warmth against my side that felt like a revelation. We were tangled on the leather sofa in the client lounge, my blazer serving as a blanket, Evelyn's head resting heavily on my shoulder. For a moment, looking at the sharp angle of her jaw softened by sleep, I forgot about the city council. I forgot about the career-ending deadline looming in exactly 4 hours. I just felt the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of her breath against my ribs and thought, I could live here. Then the alarm on my phone shattered the peace. 6 a.m. Panic should have set in. We had a half-destroyed model to rebuild and a presentation to finalize that usually took teams a month to perfect. But as Evelyn stirred, blinking those dark, intelligent eyes open and looking at me with a sleepy, unguarded smile, the panic didn't come. Instead, a terrifyingly calm confidence settled in my chest. We stood up, straightened our clothes, me smoothing the wrinkles in my shirt, Evelyn pinning her hair back with ruthless efficiency, and we went to work. The next few hours were a blur, but not the frantic, disjointed chaos of the last month. It was a flow state. The friction that had made us enemies became the engine that drove the design. We moved around the drafting table like a single organism. I glued the trees back onto the model, my fingers sticky with adhesive. She adjusted the sight lines to accommodate them without saying a word, her X-Acto knife moving with surgical grace. She handed me a fresh rendering. I handed her a lukewarm coffee. We didn't need to speak. The barrier was gone. The Ice Queen and the Idealist were dead. There was just us, building a city that could hold both steel and breath. I watched her hands, those capable, elegant hands, modify the entrance I had fought for, making it stronger, while I softened the edges of her tower. By the time we walked into City Hall, we were running on caffeine and the high of shared adrenaline. The council members sat in a row, a tribunal of gray suits and skepticism. Evelyn stepped up to the podium. Usually, she commanded a room with fear, freezing people out until they agreed. Today, she commanded it with passion. She spoke about structure, about legacy. Then she looked at me, a cue more subtle than a breath, and I stepped in. I spoke about connection, about the life between the walls. We wove our pitches together, passing the narrative back and forth seamlessly. It wasn't a debate anymore. It was a harmony. I saw the council chair, a man known for rejecting everything, lean forward. They didn't stand a chance. We didn't just sell them a building. We sold them the electricity that was crackling between us. The chemistry made the pitch undeniable. Logic warmed by emotion. Structure supported by life. When the gavel finally came down, approval granted, We maintained our composure until the heavy oak doors swung shut behind us. We walked to the elevator in silence, surrounded by the echoing marble of the municipal hallway. But the moment the steel doors slid shut, sealing us in, the professional facade dropped. Evelyn didn't say, "Good job." She turned to me, her eyes bright with victory and something much darker. She reached out, her hand brushing mine. But this time, she didn't pull back. She interlaced her fingers with mine, squeezing tight. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a promise. "My place," she said, her voice low, pressing the button for the lobby. "We have future projects to discuss." I looked at our reflection in the polished brass of the elevator doors. Two women in sharp suits, holding hands, ready to build something new. Lead the way, architect. The taxi ride was a blur of neon and anticipation. Evelyn unlocked her apartment door, the heavy click echoing the final beat of our long night. She didn't turn on the lights. She simply reached out, grabbing the lapels of my coat, and pulled me over the threshold. The tension we'd fought wasn't a flaw in the design. It was the necessary stress test for a stronger foundation. If you've ever found love in the friction of a high-stakes career, subscribe to Sapphic Legacy for more stories of desire and design.